She didn't scream. That's the first thing you need to know about Dana Pruitt. When $480,000 of crane went sideways into a Tennessee creek on a Tuesday morning in April, she stood on the opposite bank with her hands at her sides and she watched. She didn't run. She didn't radio anyone. She just stood there while the boom dragged the far bank into the water and the load line trailed off into the current like a fishing line after a big catch. 8 seconds. That's all it took. 8 seconds to end a career she had spent 20 years building one poor date at a time. Let's back up, because you need to understand what was at stake before you can understand what happened next. Dana ran crew the way a surgeon runs an operating room. Quiet, precise. The kind of project manager whose name got passed around in the kind of conversations that happened after the second drink at industry dinners. She didn't miss poor dates. She didn't go over budget. She didn't have incidents. And now she had the biggest incident any crew in Bledsoe County, Tennessee had seen in a generation. Sitting in 4 feet of creek water with its boom submerged to the second section and 22 men standing behind her, not saying a single word. The crane was a Manitowoc 999W. A lattice boom crawler, the most capable machine her company had ever leased. Brand new, and it was on its side. Here's what happened. The left rear outrigger pad went down clean during the morning setup. Looked solid, tested solid, but underneath that thin crust of earth was something nobody's survey had caught. An old stream bed, long buried, full of saturated silt that had been sitting there since before anyone alive had walked that land. The moment the crane took the weight of the precast deck panel, the pad punched through. Not slowly, not with warning. 1 second the ground was there, then it wasn't. And then a machine that weighed as much as 22 full-grown African elephants was going sideways at a speed that made grown men jump back and cover their mouths. Dana's contract had a liquidated damages clause. $18,000 a day for every day behind schedule. You do the math. She was doing the math. By the next morning, the cavalry had arrived. A recovery team from the leasing company, a geotechnical firm out of Chattanooga that sent 2 engineers who smelled like conference rooms and spoke in percentages. A rigging consultant flown in from Charlotte who had worked crane recoveries from the Gulf Coast to the upper Midwest, and who wore his experience like a coat he never took off. They looked at the site. They tested the ground. They ran the numbers. And one by one, their solutions died. A second large crane couldn't get close enough. The ground for 200 feet in every direction came back too soft to support the load. A helicopter lift was priced out and spec'd in detail and then quietly killed because the angle of the submerged boom made a vertical pick impossible without snapping it clean off. Dewatering the site would take 3 weeks minimum, and even that wasn't a guarantee that the bearing layer underneath would hold anything. Every path forward led to the same wall. By day 5, the consensus had hardened into a projection. 6 weeks. 6 weeks to solve a problem that shouldn't have taken 6 days. Do you know what 6 weeks at $18,000 a day costs? It costs more than a number. It costs the kind of thing that doesn't come back. Dana had a reputation that had taken 2 decades to build. She had a bonding capacity her company needed to bid future work. She had a crew of 22 men who needed to believe she could lead them out of a hole. And right now that hole was literal. She slept 4 hours a night. She ate standing up. She answered every call, responded to every email, and showed nothing. Because she understood, the way a person understands something only after they've been truly tested, that the worst thing a leader can do when everything is falling apart is look like everything is falling apart. On the morning of the 6th day, she was standing at the perimeter tape with a cup of coffee she'd stopped tasting 2 days ago when she heard an engine. Not a modern engine, not diesel. Something older and slower and heavier, like a sound out of a different century. She turned. A 1948 Farmall M tractor rolled to the edge of the tape and stopped, and the man climbing down from it was not one of her engineers. He was not one of her crew. He was not anyone she had called. He was 81 years old. He had a hay farm and a cattle operation whose property ran right up to the back edge of her project right of way. He had been watching from his back porch for 6 days, watching the engineers come and go, watching the ground tests, watching the calculations that kept arriving at the same dead end. And now he had driven over because, in his assessment, it was time. His name was Otis Greer. He introduced himself to Dana the way men of that generation introduced themselves, directly, without performance, with a handshake that told you everything about a life lived doing physical work. He looked at the crane for about 90 seconds. Then he told her he could put it back on its tracks. And that's where everything changed. Not with a machine, not with a calculation, but with one old farmer standing at the edge of a creek who had looked at the same problem as 12 credentialed experts and seen something completely different. The question is, what did he see that they didn't? Nobody laughed. That's important. When Otis Greer told that circle of engineers and recovery specialists that he could write a $480,000 crane using a piece of equipment that was older than most of their fathers, nobody laughed out loud. They were professionals. They had manners, but the looks that passed between them, quick, sideways, the kind that don't need words, said everything a laugh would have said, and then some. Dana saw the looks. Otis saw them too. Neither one reacted. Dana had gotten where she was by making fast reads of people, and what she read in Otis Greer in the first 30 seconds was not the thing the engineers were reading. They were seeing an old man on an old tractor with an old idea. She was seeing someone who was not nervous. And in her experience, the most dangerous thing a person could be in a room full of experts was completely, quietly unimpressed by their credentials. She asked him to explain. He didn't reach for a notepad. He didn't ask for a whiteboard. He looked back at the crane, pointed once, and started talking. He said the machine was approximately 214,000 pounds as configured. He said the center of gravity, given the position of the boom, sat roughly 11 feet above the pivot line. He said that if you applied a tipping force at the counterweight frame, not a lifting force, a tipping force, at the correct angle, you'd need less than 40,000 pounds of cable pull to start the rotation. After that, the crane's own weight would finish the job. The engineer from the geotechnical firm, the one with the master's degree from Georgia Tech, the one who had been doing most of the talking for 5 days, went quiet in a way that was different from polite quiet. It was the quiet of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking what he was arriving at. Nobody asked Otis where he got his numbers. Here's what they didn't know yet, what Dana would only learn later in pieces. Otis Greer had been operating heavy equipment since he was 12 years old, not as a hobby, not as a side interest, as the thing he did, the way his grandfather had done it before him, on the same land, with the same machines. He had spent 69 years developing the kind of knowledge that doesn't come from a textbook, the kind that comes from feel, from failure, from 10,000 hours of listening to a machine under load, and learning to tell the difference between a cable working hard and a cable about to give up. The machine he was proposing to use was a 1931 Bucyrus Erie cable excavator. His grandfather had bought it used in 1939 from a coal stripping operation that was done with it. It had been on the Greer farm ever since, disassembled and rebuilt completely in 1961, disassembled and rebuilt again in 1988, and run under load at least once a month without exception. Because Otis believed that a machine you didn't use was a machine you didn't understand anymore. Dana's rigging consultant pulled her aside. He told her carefully that he respected what the old man was saying, but that an unrated piece of vintage equipment with no load monitoring and no overload protection was a liability issue the size of a small country. If the cable failed under tension, if the machine tipped, if anything went sideways, she was looking at a situation worse than the one she already had. Dana listened to all of it. Then she asked him one question. She asked him what his current plan was producing. He didn't answer, because the answer was 6 weeks and $80,000 in liquidated damages, and a project that was falling apart in front of a client who was already making calls to her company's bonding agent. She walked back to Otis. She told him to bring the machine. The crew heard it before they saw it. That's the detail that stuck with every man on that job site for the rest of his life. The sound. It came through the tree line first, low and deliberate. A slow percussion that didn't sound rushed and didn't sound strained. It sounded like something that had been doing hard work for a long time and had stopped being dramatic about it. One of the younger operators, a 24-year-old from Pikeville named Garrett, said later that it sounded like a heartbeat. He meant it as a description. It came out sounding like a compliment. The Bucyrus Erie cleared the trees and came down the slope toward the creek bank, and the crew parted for it without being asked. Not out of fear, out of something they couldn't have named in the moment, a kind of instinctive deference, the way you step back when something certain enters the room. Otis climbed down without ceremony. He didn't address the crew. He didn't acknowledge the engineers. He walked the perimeter of the fallen crane twice, slowly, his eyes moving across the machine, the way a reader moves across a page he's read before and is checking for something specific. He crouched twice, Once at the counterweight frame, once at the lower works where the tracks met the creek bed. Then he stood up, went back to his canvas bag, and pulled out a length of 1-inch wire rope and 2 shackles. Dana's rigging consultant watched him select the attachment point and set the cable angle. He calculated it afterward. Otis was within 2 degrees of the theoretical optimum, without a computer, without a chart, without anything except 69 years of understanding how force moves through a structure. The attachment took 11 minutes. Then Otis climbed back up to the seat of a machine that had been built when Herbert Hoover was still in office, set the throttle with the same 2 fingers he'd been using for 6 decades, and engaged the drum. The cable came tight. The creek surface wrinkled where the boom entered the water, a small and strange disturbance, like the water itself was paying attention. And then, nothing. For 90 seconds, nothing moved. The cable held tension. The drum turned. The machine worked in that low, unhurried rhythm. The crew stood absolutely still. What none of them understood yet, what Otis understood completely, in his hands and in his chest, and in the sound the drum was making, was that the machine wasn't failing. It was loading. It was finding the exact point in the structure where the rotation would begin, pressing against inertia that had to be moved 1 degree at a time. The way you open a door that's been sealed shut, not with a kick, but with steady, patient, increasing pressure. Then something moved. Not the crane. Not yet. Something smaller. Something underneath. A shift in the relationship between the machine and the creek bed. A change in the way the force was traveling through the lower works. Garrett felt it in his boots before he saw it. The man next to him grabbed his arm without realizing he'd done it. Then the boom lifted clear of the water. 1 inch. Then a foot. Then the whole submerged section rising in a sheet of creek water that caught the morning light and fell in every direction at once. And the crew was already making noise, low at first, involuntary. The sound men make when something impossible starts becoming possible. The crane pivoted, slowly. Then with gathering authority, it rotated around its lower works the way a clock hand moves. Inevitable, committed, unable to stop once it had started. The moment the counterweight crossed the tipping axis, gravity switched sides. The machine that had been the problem became the solution. It dropped upright onto its tracks with a concussion that traveled through the ground and up through the boots of every man standing on that creek bank. Otis cut the throttle. The creek settled. The drum stopped. The Bucyrus Erie sat in its low, patient idle. 4 minutes and 20 seconds, start to finish. For a long moment, the only sound was the creak and the idle of that old engine. Then Garrett from Pikeville made a noise that wasn't a word, and the noise spread through 22 men like a current. And by the time Dana had registered what she was hearing, it had become something close to a roar. She was already crossing the creek on the plank they'd laid 2 days ago for the engineers who kept arriving with new reasons it couldn't be done. She didn't know what to say. That was a first. Dana Pruitt had been in rooms where things went wrong, and rooms where things went right, and she had learned the language for both. She had the vocabulary of the professional crisis, the measured assessment, the carefully worded debrief, the tone that acknowledged failure without surrendering to it. She had the vocabulary of the win, the team recognition, the quiet satisfaction, the handshake that meant more than the words around it. But standing on that creek bank with her boots wet and 22 men still making noise behind her, she crossed the plank toward Otis Greer and arrived in front of him completely empty of language. She shook his hand. That was all she had. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he expected something to work, and it worked. Not pride, not relief, just confirmation. She found words eventually. She asked him what the recovery team had missed, not as a criticism of the team. She said it plainly, as a genuine question, because she had watched 12 credentialed professionals spend 5 days arriving at the wrong answer, and she wanted to understand the distance between what they saw and what he saw. Otis thought about it for a moment. Not long. He said the answer was simple. They were trying to lift the crane. He was trying to tip it. That's it. That was the whole explanation. But sit with it for a second, because it's bigger than it sounds. Lifting the crane meant overcoming its full weight. 214,000 pounds fighting gravity straight down, requiring a machine powerful enough to match that number or exceed it, positioned on ground too soft to hold anything capable of doing the job. Every solution the experts designed was built on that same foundation, which meant every solution inherited the same impossible constraint. They were not solving the wrong problem. They were solving the right problem from inside a box they didn't know they were standing in. Otis didn't climb into the box. He walked around it. Tipping the crane meant working with gravity instead of against it. It meant finding the balance point, the precise angle at which the crane's own weight would switch from being the enemy to being the engine, and applying just enough force, at just the right place, in just the right direction, to push the machine past that line. After that, 214,000 pounds of crane became an asset. The machine finished the job itself. He hadn't lifted anything. He had simply moved the balance until the balance moved everything else. The Georgia Tech engineer stood close enough to hear all of this. He didn't say anything. Later, Dana heard this secondhand. He told a colleague that the principle Otis had applied was not obscure. It was elementary, the kind of thing that appeared in the first semester of any mechanical engineering program. What he couldn't explain, and what kept him quiet on that creek bank, was how he had spent 5 days looking directly at the problem and never seen it. Dana thought she knew why, but she kept it to herself. She also asked about the machine, not out of politeness, out of genuine need to understand, because what she had watched for 4 minutes and 20 seconds didn't match anything in her experience of how equipment behaved. Otis explained it without drama. The Bucyrus Erie had no load management computer, no automatic cutout, no overload interlock. Every modern crane, every modern recovery rig, every piece of equipment her company operated was built with systems designed to stop the machine before it reached its limit. Systems that made decisions on behalf of the operator, that said this far and no further, that protected the machine and the load and the crew from the consequences of human misjudgment. The Bucyrus Erie had none of that. The cable would break before the machine would stop, which meant the only limiter was Otis. He watched the tension through his hands. He listened to the drum. He had learned over 69 years on that seat to read a load the way a doctor reads a pulse, not from a monitor, not from a readout, but from direct contact with the thing itself, through the medium of wire rope and steel drum, and the low vibration of an engine that had been communicating with him for longer than most of his crew had been alive. He knew when to hold. He knew when to let it breathe. He knew in the 90 seconds when nothing moved and the cable was loading against the inertia of 214,000 pounds of sideways crane, that the machine was not failing. It was working. He knew it the way you know a sleeping child is breathing, not because you can prove it in the moment, but because you have paid enough attention for long enough that certainty stops requiring proof. Dana thought about her grandfather. She hadn't thought about him in years. Not deliberately, not like this. He had run equipment for the Tennessee Valley Authority in the 1940s, a man who operated by feel and sound, and the kind of accumulated knowledge that doesn't transfer through instruction, only through time. He used to say that a good operator could feel a load the way a doctor feels a pulse. She had heard that saying so many times as a child that it had gone transparent, the way familiar words do. Standing on a creek bank in Bledsoe County with a righted crane dripping behind her, it became visible again. She wondered how much she had optimized herself out of understanding, how many computers she trusted because trusting them was faster than learning what they were measuring, how many readouts she read instead of listening to the machine behind them. She had built a career on precision, and precision had always felt like understanding. Standing there, it occurred to her for the first time that they might not be the same thing. Otis asked for nothing. He said the machine had needed the work anyway. Dana didn't accept that. Not because she was required to compensate him. There was no contract, no negotiation, no invoice. But because she had grown up in a world where a debt that went unpaid had a way of calcifying into something that couldn't be dissolved later. Her company, Ridgeline Civil Contractors, funded the construction of a new storage building on the Greer property, climate-controlled, insulated, built to last. The Bucyrus Erie moved in, and the Bucyrus Erie stayed. The Manitowoc was repaired on site by the manufacturer's team over 4 days, inspected, certified, and returned to service. The overpass project, the one that was supposed to cost 6 weeks of delay and enough in liquidated damages to wound a company, opened 8 days ahead of the revised schedule. Dana shook hands with the client's representative on a completed bridge deck and said nothing about what had happened in the creek, because there are wins you announce and wins you simply carry. Calvin Greer, Otis's son, continued to run the Bucyrus Erie after his father got older. In the spring of 2011, a neighbor's grain cart broke through a pond levee 2 miles from the farm. Calvin took the machine out on a Tuesday morning and had the cart recovered before noon. He didn't advertise it. He went home and had lunch. All 4 of Otis's grandchildren learned to operate the machine. The family rule, unwritten, unquestioned, was that you learned at 12 years old, the same age Otis had learned from his grandfather on the same seat. The machine moved down through the family the way certain things do in certain families, not as an inheritance of money, but as an inheritance of understanding, the slow and serious transfer of knowledge from one pair of hands to the next. Otis Greer passed away in the winter of 2017. Dana drove 3 hours on a January morning, roads gray, sky low, to a small Baptist church in Bledsoe County where the parking lot was full and people were standing along the walls inside. She told the story. Badly, she said later. She was not built for eulogies, and the feeling kept getting ahead of the words. But she told it honestly, which in a room full of people who already knew the story is the only thing that matters. What she said at the end stayed with her long after she said it. She said Otis didn't care about new or old. He didn't care about modern or vintage, about certified or uncertified, about the degree on the wall or the lack of one. He cared about one thing, whether the person running the machine had taken the time to truly understand it, not to operate it, not to manage it, to understand it, the way you understand something when you've taken it apart and put it back together twice, when you've run it under load every month for decades, when your hands know the difference between a cable working and a cable lying. She paused there, in that church, in front of people who had known Otis their whole lives. Then she said she was still working on that, and everyone in the room knew exactly what she meant, because everyone who has ever been genuinely good at something and genuinely honest about it knows the same quiet truth. Understanding is not a destination, it's a direction. You don't arrive at it. You just keep moving toward it, one load at a time, until the day you don't. The Bucyrus Erie is still on the Greer farm. It still runs.